Welcome back to Marcelina, my Reliance 44 sailboat project with another update. Well, last time we talked about some of the wiring work I was doing inside the boat. We put the binnacle back together, including a compass with its new light, added a couple of dorades to the top. We installed lighting in the main cabin along with the ceiling panels. I installed our new port light frames and a custom rigging part. Added a fuel filter and water separator, and ensured the safe transport of my soul across the River Styx. And we were in the process of making new wooden cockpit seats. We were also fixing and beefing up the mainmast spreaders. Now in this update, it's almost exclusively going to be exterior woodwork, including the hatch cover. Also, I'm going to touch on just a bit of the start of the work on the rudder. So let's get to it. Woodwork was quite tedious, including quite a lot of wood preparation, including having to replace some of the individual components of the hatch cover, as well as making the new seats for the cockpit. Once everything was prepped, I put on 6 coats of a 2-part varnish, with light sanding between each coat. The whole project took about 6 weeks, including some mistakes I made along the way, which I learned from and then I pressed on. One interesting aspect of all this wood finishing that I did was that a friend of mine had actually stored all this wood in his basement for the last several years. He was going to get to it, but in his defense, he had lots of other things to take care of and never really got around to it. So finally, when I decided that it was time to get this woodwork done, I went over to his house. We set up in his basement, and after getting the wood all prepped and ready to varnish, we put the first coat of varnish on. Well, sure enough, his wife comes home and takes one whiff of the varnish wafting up from the basement, and she decides that this will not do. So I came over, picked up all the wood, packed it all up, brought it back to my own house, cleared out my shed, and then I did all the work in my shed. It wasn't ideal conditions because it wasn't a completely dust-free environment and so forth, but things worked out pretty well. Next was to clean up the areas in the cockpit where the wood was going to be put in place. There was a lot of pigeon poop in the cockpit, and I didn't want to have to clean it twice. So after I cleaned it up, I built myself a little tent over the area to keep it clean. Then I laid out all the parts, and then I began reinstalling, including the wooden rails and the hatch cover that rides on the rails. They use stainless steel piano hinges for the seats that cover the lazarettes. You can see that I painted the inside of the seats white to keep them nice and clean and bright. As far as the current rudder, the idea was to remove the rudder so that I could assess the bearings and the packing where the rudder comes up into the cockpit. The rudder isn't obviously original since it's just a steel plate welded to a shaft, so some previous owner must have replaced the original rudder with this new version. And as you can see here, the rudder post has a lot of corrosion. So the guys from Marine moved the boat out of the shed. In fact, this was the first time that the boat had been out of the shed and seen sunlight in about 4 years. So anyway, we moved it out and we were able to drop the rudder. Now before this was done, I had removed the prop in hopes that the rudder would clear the drive shaft. Although I did not remove the prop correctly, and I opened up the area where the self-feathering prop was packed with grease, and I had to basically reassemble it and send it off to a dealer to make sure that I didn't do any permanent damage to it. So we'll see what that looks like when it comes back. Even so, the rudder post wouldn't clear the drive shaft, so ultimately I had to pull the shaft out of the boat itself so that the rudder would come out. But unfortunately, this was only after the rudder actually dinged the threads on the drive shaft, and I've since had to use what's called a thread chaser to repair the threads. With that, the rudder came off, and then they put the boat back in the shed. Now, they put the boat back in backwards from the way it was stored previously, and that's so when I get a new rudder, we'll have access to the back of the boat, and we can use equipment, forklifts, or whatever we need to put the new rudder back up into the boat. So next time, we're going to be exploring the options for a new rudder, and hopefully that will be well underway. We'll also be replacing the rudder bearing and the packing for the rudder where it comes up through the hull. And by the way, the packing is just a waxy rope-like material that allows the shaft to move without letting water into the boat. Also going to be replacing the drive shaft cutlass bearing and also the drive shaft packing to make sure that that's not leaking. And we want to make sure that that's in place, so we put the drive shaft back in before we put back on the rebuilt prop. So that should keep me busy for a few months, and we will see you next time for the next update for Marcelina, my Reliance 44 sailboat. Thanks.